Anyone imagine where that building is? Austria. Are you Austrian?
No.
Oh, right.
Like the little, like, not trace, but like the things in the window.
Yeah, little clues. Yeah, well, it's fairly close. It's in Switzerland, but, you know, more, you know, sort of central Europe. Well, it's not Europe, and of course, Europe doesn't exist anymore. So it was a topical joke there, but it didn't really work. Anyway, let's move on. So I guess the kind of argument in this talk, or the proposition, is that architecture and placemaking, we tell stories through our buildings. Point one. What are those stories? Point two is I think we can look at ordinary things. So to me, that building is 450 years old, built out of timber. I just love it. It's kind of messy, it's stained, it tells stories, who's lived there, you know, so there's a kind of whole theatre in architecture. But so point one is architecture tells stories. Point two is I think we can look at ordinary buildings cleverly. And point three, we might think about different ways in which we look at buildings. And broadly, I've given them some fairly sort of pretentious titles: pattern, poetry, and something that's completely gone out of my mind at the moment, but it begins with P, which we'll find later on. Surely you remember that from the last talk. No, thank you very much for your support. Right, this doesn't work either, so it's good. Excellent, that's really, okay, we'll have to really use this. Principle, yeah, principle. So this is I'm assuming everyone in the audience reads The Guardian. No? Okay, second bad assumption. A lovely, lovely piece in The Guardian recently about it's the place that invents the novel, not the novel as the place. So I suppose what I'm trying to say there, through the words of Faye Weldon, is that by understanding, I think architects don't understand place, ordinary places, very well. And I think part of our training is to improve that kind of understanding. You come from somewhere in Greece, don't you?
I do.
Could you tell me where that is?
That might be Tinos or any Aegean island. Not any, but the Cyclades somewhere.
It is Tinos. I went there and had a terrible holiday. I was on my own. I just got completely miserable. There was no alcohol there because it's a pilgrimage island. But what I did find were these buildings. Can anyone speculate what they are? Yeah?
Castles, towers,
Castles. In a way, they are castles, actually. They are castles for pigeons. In that part of the world, pigeons are kept for various reasons, including what I think is called guava, isn't it, which is what comes out of the rear of the pigeon. And why I love them is they are really well designed for pigeons. They're off the ground, so animals can't get to them. They have ledges so that the pigeons can sit there and sun themselves. They're painted white, so the pigeons can sort of see them. And of course, they are symbols of the kind of the farmer's wealth. You know, there's a kind of competition going on in Tinos, saying, well, actually, I've got a nicer kind of pigeon loft. So if you do get a chance to go to Tinos and you are teetotal, you'll have a very good holiday there. Where is that? Did someone say Morocco? Is it Morocco? Are you Moroccan?
No.
Right.
But the towers.
Yeah? Someone else? It's university. There's no right answers. You can say anything and we can work it to our advantage.
No idea.
No idea. It could be anywhere. It could be universal then. It's actually a hill town in the north of Italy, a place called San Gimignano. And San Gimignano has historically had 72 towers like that. So that essentially is Manhattan. Now, you're still okay with hearing? Yeah? That's an extraordinary thing because you'd think, well, Italian hill towns, they're the kind of embodiment of medieval contextualism and kind of friendly architecture. But actually, the reality is 72, maybe 73 massive towers. Now, eventually, some of them collapsed. Some of them were dismantled out of kind of feudal wars. But basically, it was a standoff between two medieval families saying who was richest. So it's a kind of Romeo and Juliet battle. So the point is, the old is really, really interesting, but not in a kind of necessarily romantic perspective, that it's actually quite often very radical. And actually, in architecture schools, all we look at are pretty pictures of modern buildings, which I'm going to show you in a moment. But, you know, there's more to the world than the Architectural Review. Who are these two people?
Architects.
That's a good gamble. Who said that? Well, we're all architects, aren't we? We're all discoverers of the place. But if I said they weren't architects...
Shackleton.
Oh. So which one's Shackleton?
Guy on the left.
Guy on the left. Who's the guy on the right?
Amundsen.
Oh, the Norwegian sort of competitor. That... Are we allowed to give out degrees? Have a degree, mate. Yeah, well done. You can go home now. I didn't say which category. They are the same person. That is Shackleton 3 months after going across either Antarctica or the Arctic, I always forget which one. Basically what happened, his ship got crushed by the ice. So this is a really moving story. He had to row through the frozen wastes with a group of men to get help, to get back. He failed 3 times, I think 3 or maybe 2 times. On the 3rd time, he did get through to the Falkland Islands. So in 3 months, he changed from quite a dapper young bloke to someone more of my age. Pause for comic effect. Yeah. So I guess the point is that the environment, both culturally and physically, where we work and occupy as architects, massively changes. And here's the evidence, you know, it's extraordinary, that evidence. So, pattern principle and poetry, you could call it what you want, you could call it typology, determinism, and abstraction if you wanted to. But 3 different ways of kind of looking at buildings. So I'm going to look at some buildings that I really like and have visited, so they're kind of in my soul a bit. Anyone read Middlemarch? Oh. Middlemarch is about that thick, so I wouldn't, you can probably read a summary on Wikipedia or something. But Middlemarch is a Victorian novel that looks at the changes that happen on a community during the Industrial Revolution, but also the changes that happen to 2 people set within that. It's an absolutely fantastic examination of what happens inwardly and outwardly. And the 2 main protagonists are Dorothea and Will Ladislow. And as you can imagine, there's a kind of love story sitting beneath it. But what she's really interested in is planning ordinary cottages. This isn't some fantastic kind of Russian heiress kind of type of Anna Karenina kind of model. This is a kind of about ordinary lives, ordinary landscapes, ordinary buildings. So, anyone Spanish? Or prepared to admit to being Spanish? No, so do you have an admissions procedure where you don't admit no Spanish people? Okay, well this building is at the more or less at the bottom of Spain in a place called Murcia. And it's not a particularly good slide, but I'd like, this is the one that doesn't work, isn't it? No, it's the one that does work. Right. I'm talking about that building, but hold in your mind that building. The point I want to sort of develop in this bit, this got a first segment of the 3 segments, is looking at buildings typologically, okay? So Murcia needed a new town hall. It's designed by Moneo, I forget the date, but that's less important. And in some senses, he looks back at Alto's San Gonzalo town hall, which I think is, and this is going to sound really fluffy, but when I went to see that with a mate, it actually made me cry. I know that you're going to think, how weird, but I thought that absolutely stands for what I believe architecture can be. This is innately subtle building that kind of belongs to that sort of simple context of that part of Finland, or humble context. But the key point is that the town, the kind of chamber, if you like, the parliament, is kind of nested. It's not sort of heroically put at the top, it's kind of nested. So there's a kind of democratic agenda that's kind of underpinning this simple building. What I really I mean, you may hate this building, but what I really love about it is the way that it kind of understands the kind of grammar of this part of the city. So it's essentially a building that's lifted up. It's a nice, is that yours? Do you want the name of... nice ringtone that was nice. Why would it be lifted up, do you think? Why are the special rooms high up? Awkward silence. Well, what I find... Say again?
To get more light.
Possibly to get, yeah, one answer, another answer.
Get a better view.
Better view, yeah.
Be further away from the riffraff on the street.
Yeah.
Show off.
Show off. Yeah, so actually the kind of point is that probably it started off that kind of move to be sort of out, to get away, to defend yourself, to be away from, whoever said that word, riffraff, but also to get away from damp. You know, prior to sort of damp-proof courses, you know, the ground floor is vulnerable. So you get this kind of overlaying of a kind of symbolic showing off kind of metaphor with something that's practical. And that's really the core of what I'm trying to get across, is that things can be practical and kind of symbolic in equal measure. I think the syncopated rhythm of the facade, you know, these kind of missing columns, is really interesting. So it's kind of, for me, it feels much more kind of accessible or friendly. Remember, this is 1976, so it's not, you know, we are in charge of the people. It's more more conciliant relationship with the people as represented by the square. The building's actually quite, it's more sort of white in colour, but at night it adopts this kind of pink hue. But the key thing that I really love about it is that here is the audience, the principal democratic chamber, and it is basically set up to be accountable to this kind of hat in the air, kind of Baroque cathedral. So that kind of symbolic axis, I suppose you would call it, or kind of presence of the church. Remember, this is a highly Catholic country. Yeah, is kind of embodied in the architecture. So it's rather cleverly kind of messy, if you want to use that word, and not overly formal, but has these kind of typological clues and kind of references that essentially belong to that part of the world, in my view. It's a bad photo, but you can see that the main debating space has this kind of alignment. Second chapter, if you like, talks about buildings that, so the first chapter is suggesting the idea that when we're designing, we can look at things typologically, we can understand the kind of grammar. Sometimes we call that precedent, but usually precedent just ends up in copying a building. So understanding the grammar rather than the fullness of something. Second way of working is to establish a kind of determinism or a controlling criteria that you want to fulfill. Now, this building is also in Spain. It just so happened I went to Spain 2 or 3 years ago, and is just at the bottom of the Pyrenees. So if you do want to go there, you're probably best to fly to Barcelona and get a train up. So it's a city called Vic, V-I-C, and it used to have the most monasteries in any city, I think. It's got a colossal number of monasteries and convents. Anyway, this kind of folded origami building is like that for at least 2 reasons. The first is that this is a massive building. I haven't got the sections, but believe me, there's as much underground as there is above ground. So you're sitting in a kind of broadly historic context, and I know some of you are going to be working in Bath soon for your final projects. So the kind of camouflaging or the settling of the building into the ground and the breaking up is a kind of criteria that Llinàs, I think, is kind of using. The second one, which actually I personally find more interesting, is that there are a whole load of routes that go through here, because there's a river down here. And basically, this building is punctured three-dimensionally by a whole series of footpaths that sort of go above, below, through. So it's incredibly complicated as a piece of kind of contextual architecture, but it allows it to kind of sit within the city, but for the city still to sort of connect through it. It's not just this kind of monolith that you have to kind of go round. Really nice, interesting, in my view, piece of work. And there you see it as you walk towards the river. So you can see here, this is one of the kind of major ends of one of the paths. I think there's another one here. You know, it's basically a piece of origami that's kind of woven through. Anyone speculate why the ceiling is like that? Yep. Sound.
Absorb the sound or move the sound voice straight to the...
Yeah. Actually, that is, I hadn't thought of that. I mean, obviously, form-wise, that's to do with, but in terms of the decoration.
Sound waves.
Yeah, it's like a reference to
Sound waves.
ambience.
Of course, in everyone's imagination, it can be all of those things. When I spent a day there talking to the people who sort of curate or, in effect, the client, and they asked everyone in the city what was most important to them. And pretty well everyone said is the mountains. So these are contour lines that have been abstracted into decoration. Now, a lot of people in the city loathe the building and call it the Ferrero Rocher building because it's kind of wrapped in this kind of gold kind of foil. I mean, obviously, those people are absolute idiots. And now, I'm sure they're very nice. If anyone knows anyone in Vic, they're not. Because it's all on film, isn't it? So we don't want to be sued or anything like that. So I think that the kind of topographical echo, if you like, in the decoration, to me, is just wonderful. This is a big building that kind of belongs. It's a powerful building, but it's not dainty in its kind of contextualism. You might argue that it belongs typologically to the tradition of Hans Scharoun's Philharmonie. How am I doing for time, by the way?
You're doing really well. You're less.
Oh, sorry. Anyone been here? Oh, yeah. Good? Is it good? Yeah?
It's much better in real life than in pictures.
Oh, that's a nice political answer.
I had tutors loving that building, and I said, ooh, it's crowded, why? But when you experience the room and the acoustics of the room,
Yeah.
it's mesmerizing. I was really impressed.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, when I was your age, which was not your age, but your age. Oh, God. Anyway, a long time ago, shall we say, I went to a lecture by the person who wrote the book on Hans Scharoun, and it absolutely changed my life. That was a really massively embarrassing moment, wasn't it? So, and it was like sort of starstruck, and when I just said, "Oh, you've just changed my life, mate." Obviously, he looked a bit embarrassed and sort of shuffled off, but this is organic architecture, but not in the kind of fluid, curvy sense. In effect, it's two, I think it's hexagon, maybe octagons that interlock. But recently I went there and I was sitting here and I could hear the noise of someone's hand on the string. It's so intense. You can actually, in actual fact, you can walk from any part of the auditorium to any other part without going into the foyer. So essentially what Scharoun was trying to do was A, gather the audience around the orchestra, so you had that absolute kind of visceral connection to the music and the players, and B, so basically it's theatre in the round, and B, connect everyone to everyone else. And as a result of that, it's probably the finest concert hall probably in the world, actually, acoustically. Certainly one is right up there. So it kind of works acoustically, it works symbolically, and it's just magnificent. To be honest, on the outside, it doesn't look that great. So would you concur with that?
I think for 20 years I knew that building through black and white pictures.
Yeah.
And architecture, theoretical.
Yeah, people banging on about it, yeah.
Yes, that's the experience of being there. If you ever go to Berlin, people set their tickets at the door. So go any evening, go for any concert, buy a cheap ticket and go experience the place live.
It is, I know, you know, you're probably fed up of old people talking about old buildings, but if you look beyond what it looks like, and you look to how it works and what it stands for, it is enchanting. The other thing it stands for, apparently Sharoon was brought up on a shipyard, so he was used to looking at things, big things from underneath, ships sort of propped up. But what I really love about it is it's not a building of signs, well, not in the literal sense. In a sense, it choreographs your movement through, so you're led through the building quite naturally, rather than a big sign saying, you know, lecture room, whatever, lecture room, what number is this? 1R?
126.
I mean, it's a great title for a lecture room, isn't it? 1R26. So the kind of choreography, so I think when we're working as architects, we need to think that people move through buildings, they don't just march through buildings and then turn a corner, you know, so it's a piece of dance, really. In a similar kind of vein, in terms of sort of determinism, Donald Toomey's fabulous LSE building is determined by light. Basically, this is a building that's carved, because it's a very, very dense site in London, to allow rights of light into adjacent buildings. So deterministic factors, whether they're acoustic, sociological, symbolic, or in this case, photophilic, to do with light, are a very, very powerful device because it takes you into kind of unusual places. I mean, that's an unusual building. But the one that I really like is in a place called the Rapperswil. Anyone Swiss? Oh, so where do you live? You're half Swiss. You don't? Well, how can you say you're Swiss then? Where were you born? Right, so that's kind of the French bit, isn't it? Sort of over there. So this is the, anyway, you probably know where Rapperswil is, don't you? Yeah, anyway, thank you very much for your very thorough description of the Swiss landscape. Rapperswil is halfway down Lake Zurich, and I go there a lot because that's where my PhD is kind of based. I mean, that's completely irrelevant, I'm just kind of showing off. But I don't know what I'm talking about now. It's a building halfway down Lake Zurich. And this building was a building that was essentially, if you look at the plan, that was trying to connect the town archive, which was originally in two bits with a kind of horrible bit in the middle, connect it as one coherent piece. But because the adjacent buildings are so sort of wonderfully medieval and sort of, inverted commas, chaotic, or you wouldn't call them disordered, but not sort of logically, or, well, not geometrically ordered, the architects decided to form the extension by making sure they missed every single opening, every existing opening. So you get this kind of weird origami kind of building that's driven by quite definite criteria. It's a really nice piece of work, and there it is. So the door is here, so this sort of flips up. And when you're inside, you get this kind of pixelated light. So it's unashamedly modern, and you could say acontextual. And yet it's driven by all sorts of criteria that it finds, intelligently finds, by examining the site and the buildings and all the rest of it. It's called the Llinàs building. It's got, in effect, two faces. It looks out to the Alps beyond and then back into the city, and has this, it's basically a piece of architectural dentistry that's kind of slotted in. So you have to go to Spain, you have to go to Switzerland. Obviously we've got a very good guide over there who will help you plan the trip thoroughly. But you also need to go to Norway. So this, I guess people look at Zumthor, do they? Probably look at Zumthor. No? Yes? No? Don't know who he is. He's a Swiss architect, so you can see the way this is going. This is a building in the north, the northernmost bit of Norway. And it is a memorial, which I'll talk about in a moment. It takes, when I went there, I lied to my mate and said that it would take about a day to get there. Anyway, on day 3, my mate said, Mark, we've been driving at twice the speed limit for 3 days and we're still only halfway there. At which point I admitted I had lied and that if we kept going, it would be worth it. And it was worth it. This is an extraordinarily interesting building that utterly is driven by a kind of quite defined criteria, but sort of poetic criteria as well. Vadso, where it's located, in the medieval mind is where everyone thought the devil lived. So that was part of my sort of pitch to my mate. Why don't we go and see the devil, depending on your belief system, for a holiday? We might not come back, but, you know, it'd be a good day out. When I went there, I chatted to some of the people there, and they told me that the motto of the town is that darkness shall give way to the sun. Can anyone speculate why they would have that as a motto? Shall I? Yeah.
Very long winters, very long summers.
Thank you. Have a degree. What type do you want?
I'll have yours.
My degree. Well, then we need to talk about money. Because, but yeah, you could have it. It's kind of worthless. So anyway, no, it's not. It's not. Second awkward moment. Where's my awkward moment monitor? The lady over here is. Can you just put your hand up when we sort of cross the line? Of course, for half of the year, this town is in complete darkness. So you can see why the devil might choose to live there. This is more serious. This is a town about the size of our campus, where 97 people were executed for witchcraft over a period of about, I forget the actual figure, something like 30 years. So there's a kind of unholy alliance between the church and landowners. This is a terrible, terrible thing. Well, let's not go into the kind of theology of kind of witchcraft, but this is a memorial to all of those lives, all of those stories. And it's, in my view, a kind of masterpiece of architectural remembering. It belongs to a period in Zumthor's work where he was doing some work in the zinc mines of halfway up Norway, and was interested in this kind of skeletal architecture. It's almost like a kind of spider, isn't it? I know spiders have been in the news recently with the judge with her lovely brooch, but these structures that host something else. So it belongs to a kind of preoccupation that he has. It also belongs to an agenda of the Norwegian tourist authority, who are trying to draw people up to the top of Norway with architectural events. So architectural events are fantastic bait. So when you're all practicing, target the local tourist authority, because you'll get an unlimited budget and nice trips abroad. So it's a useful piece of advice. In that part of the world, fish are left out to dry, because if you think about it, for 6 months of the year, you can't see. So you've got to preserve your food. So there's a kind of atmosphere, for want of a better word, of these kind of skeletal tectonic structures with things hanging out. Now, Zumthor has never spoken about that, and obviously I'm interpreting it through my own eyes, but I think who would not be affected by these extraordinary structures sitting on the landscape? Apparently, when Zumthor arrived, he arrived in a very fashionable linen suit, which is favoured by many an architect. Is that true, isn't it? Yeah. Which is probably a bit of a stupid thing to do, because Norway is frankly bloody cold. So you have to edit out bloody. But anyway, so he arrives and he's trying to understand place. When we're doing architecture, we tend to sort of parachute in as architects. How do we understand place? How do we understand the story of what we are adding to? That's what it looks like at night. Does anyone, this is a really tough question, it's really unfair. Why would you have those random lights like that? Yeah?
Is it to symbolise the sun going up and down?
That's a fabulous answer. It could be that. Of course it could be. I mean, that's the point about reading and the stories, isn't it? When we read a story, it can be any story. But the kind of diurnal rhythm, that's a really I'm going to nick that and claim that as my own. So, the diurnal rhythm. Apparently, and I only got this because I stayed there quite a long time chatting to people, when Peter Zumthor got off the plane, little local plane, he said, what are all those lights in the window? Why are all the lights on, even though it's daytime? And the answer was, that tells everyone that we're alive. I mean, isn't that just wonderful? That the light is, you know, it can be read as the kind of the cycle of life, you know, the kind of sun rising and the sun setting. But also, it stands for each lost soul, each lost story of each person who's been executed. So the light is, of course, a means of letting in light, but it stands for something else as well. And next to it is a fabulous witch memorial by the sculptress Louise Bourgeois, who sadly died a while ago. When I was there, which is fantastic, obviously this is a really quite a moving memorial, but kids were just running around it. So I think in any kind of narrative story, watch out for the kids, because for them it's a playground, for us it's a kind of symbolic move. And that's what it's like inside. So there's no fancy sculptures, there's no super narrative written, it's just the names of the people, when they were executed, where they lived. So this is a kind of gallery in the true sense of the word, with these memories of light. The other rhyme that I think Zumthor's playing on is the kind of maritime rhyme. Obviously at the top of Norway, basically you're living off the sea. So ships, sails, boats are part of that. So this fantastic gangplank, if you like, leading into this kind of whale or this kind of billowing sail sitting within the structure, I think has all these kind of, for me anyway, resonances with that context without mimicking it. You know, it kind of implies and sort of suggests these sort of connections. So basically, he's looking at things that fish hang on, sails, and people's stories. That's a section. I have no idea how it stands up, to be honest. I suppose it's so, well, I suppose you can work it out, can't you, that the bit you walk on is quite solid. Everything else is this kind of meniscus around it. But it's wonderfully asymmetric. Because of the weather, it's got a massive overhang one side and less so the other side. So even its kind of simplicity, it has this kind of nuance. Like any good architectural student, you have to get into ridiculously awkward positions to get a really key photograph. Is that true when you go to look at buildings? You don't want any people in them. You put your, vivid thing selection on your iPhone. Can you help me out? I mean, what else do you do? Stand in the middle of the street. Yeah, so at some stage you just get run over, don't you? And that is the handle that takes you into the building. So it's essentially a tiller. So there's these kind of rhymes. Quick time check. Right, I need to speed up. Right, okay, so there's a pretty picture with an odd quote. I think basically as architects we're trying to paint or if you think of a portrait doesn't need to be it's not a photograph. It evokes the true essence of something. I think that's what Dostoevsky is talking about. For me, I think the picture's fantastic because it's got these two sort of connectors to the kind of virtual world. One is the, depending on a belief system, the church, and the other one is the kind of mobile phone mast. Yeah, how we sort of connect to what's beyond the normal. So, last building, do people know this? Our Swiss consultant over here. So, you do know it. It feels to me that there's some unfinished business in Switzerland for you to yeah. Anyway, this is not too far from Geneva. It's near Milan, so you can fly to Milan. Rather movingly, the students last year, and this was after the marking, not before the marking, bought me and my sweetheart a ticket to this spa, which actually is my second moment of crying. When I went there, I just thought, what a fantastic thing to do, and what a fantastic place. So I don't know what the point of saying that is, just to say that it's a nice place. Yeah, remember that, yeah. This is what it used to look like. At that point of time, the spa waters were very, very sort of key well, actually the whole of Europe, actually. And so spas and water were considered to be kind of restorative. Ironically, you could argue our attitude to water is a bit more, well, it's just there and we can just chuck our rubbish in. If you look at the amount of plastic in the oceans, that, our relationship to water is quite problematic. So here was the first spa. Roll on, I don't know, 30 years. Someone, a German guy, built a 400-bedroom hotel. So that's like building a 400-bedroom hotel in, I don't know, let's think of a small place around here, Blagden. No one knows where Blagden is. Anyway, you get the point. But actually, even Zumthor's even sort of recognised or sort of resonated with that. So remember this view. So in the back, right at the back, up there, is the 400 costs. And of course, no one came, so it went bust. And then he got the job to kind of revitalise it and built this kind of gorgeous, gorgeous spa. In some senses, I think Zumthor utterly, I mean, he probably would be angry at me saying this, but I think he utterly understands the kind of tradition of Romanic bathing, particularly in Bath, the kind of chambers and the sort of sequences from hot to cold, cold to hot sometimes. And really the building is the changing rooms on the left, there's a kind of inner pool, and then these chambers of different qualities that you move through. It's made of this stuff called gneiss stone, which belongs to the mountains in that area. And when I went there recently, I couldn't drive home. Not because I was drunk, but I was just so relaxed and enchanted by this place. I said to my sweetheart, I don't know, I don't use the term sweethearts, no, you're just my bloke or girl or whatever they are. Anyway, Fran, we just need to stay here infinitely. And now that's why we've got no money. Because but the other thing I found was it was full of beautiful people, and I had to stay under the water for quite a long period of time until there was a gap so I could get out so no one could look at me. But you're obviously all beautiful, so that's not a problem. This kind of belonging and this kind of camouflaging and this presence, which is both historic in the kind of primal sense, but also topographic in so much that it sort of settles into the landscape, actually does not obliterate the hotel that's behind it. So that's kind of really interesting. Most of us would think, well, that's terrible, that's the 1950s and modern, we should get rid of it, knock it down. So I think everything matters, and you can work with everything, I think. That's the kind of palette. You remember the first slide, where we thought maybe it was in Austria or that part of the world. And this kind of stratified stone. So this is a building that's about layers in its materiality, but layers in a sort of macro sense. How hot do you think the water is on the picture in the right? Or cold, yeah. 45. Fahrenheit or centigrade?
Celsius.
You remember the last thing, don't you? You know when you run a bath and you put your toe in and you think, yeah, this is all right. And then about a second, maybe it's about half a second later, you realise it's fiercely too hot, by which time it's too late. It's kind of that temperature. It is shockingly hot. This is natural water. And of course, the room is painted red. So the kind of material resonance and the absolute presence of this room, I can still feel the heat on me. It kind of makes you just kind of fall asleep once you realise you're not being burnt. The main pool, I think, is something like 19. So that's a big temperature difference. So that this kind of move between these chambers is extraordinary. In this kind of underground world, look at the blue lights coming through, which is also looking out to the landscape. So eventually you swim through some chains and come into this external pool, and these kind of chutes here are pushing out water so hard that it's like, I don't know how many people in the audience have been hit in the face. Probably none of you, by the but you know, it's that kind of whoa, you know. So this is a kind of visceral experience with the Alps sort of coming towards you. So almost there. About maybe 5 years ago, I forget the architects, I think they're American, proposed, I think it's a 150-meter tall tower of glass next to the spa. What do we think? Who's going to? Yep.
So now, why is they need this tower in this small village?
Well, the reason this village is struggling to survive because the spa used to be its principal income.
Right.
Yeah. So when you read this kind of the story about the place, we need to revitalize our spa. And the second part, and this is the true translation from what I taped it from the promotional stuff, we as a spa are committed to hedonism.
Right, yeah, makes sense.
You're committed to hedonism?
So, hedonism.
Yeah,
Yes.
but you've got your clothes on at the moment.
I'm very hedonist man.
Oh, right, so underneath is, yeah. Right. Well, I mean, that's quite an interesting brief, isn't it? Can you give me a place of full-on hedonism? So let's take a vote. Who thinks it's okay? And the second vote is who thinks it's not okay. So you've got to vote. It's not like Brexit. Okay. So, pardon? It's residential. It's for incurably wealthy people. People who've got so much wealth that you cannot reduce it. Does that change your vote? Okay, so let's vote. Who thinks it's okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's some 6. There's some quite, yeah, not much. Maybe not much. Who thinks it's not okay? Okay, so there's a general sort of consensus that it's not okay. I'm kind of have mixed feelings. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. I mean, obviously, glass cannot disappear like that. Oh, I need to stop. Right. Yeah, we're almost there. Right. Yeah. Personally, if you're that wealthy, why don't you just hire a helicopter and go and live on the top of the mountain? And when you look at the plan of this, the amount of circulation, so the plan of it is about the size of this room, and half of it is lifts. So it's kind of a bit inefficient. But in that part of the world, this is Pisa, I think. I remember my first slide of all the towers. In this part of the world, it was not unusual to have lots and lots of towers, because that's a very, very efficient way. You didn't vote, by the way, did you?
No, because I also was in between.
Oh, this is why we're in the mess now, politically. Anyway, cities were full of towers. And in Ireland, the monasteries used to build towers, A, to landmark their monastery, and B, to hide their possessions when marauding British people came across the channel. So Switzerland actually does have issues. So actually, when we make these kind of reactions, it's always more complicated. Personally, I think the tower is not great. I think it's not great, but I think it's curious how it does have a kind of resonance. So, last slide. Back to our friend Dorothea. By this time, things have worked out well for her. I think we should look very carefully at the ordinary buildings of the world, what she would call the unvisited tombs. Yeah, the very ordinary, simple places that surround us, and draw our architecture from it. So we've got 10 minutes now to discuss, haven't we? Discuss.